Western colonial expansion pursued since the 1400s had become normal policy. From the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, however, it took on a more aggressive and systematic character, referred to by many as the New Imperialism. As a practical undertaking, this domination of the world was an impressive military feat, and it brought Europe and America great power and wealth. On the other hand, it was inseparable from bloodshed, racial prejudice, and slavery. As the English-Polish author Joseph Conrad wrote in the novel Heart of Darkness, one of the classic literary depictions of European imperialism, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Moreover, Euro-American imperialism left deep political scars around the globe, many of which have not yet healed in the 21st century. A variety of factors enabled and motivated the new imperialism. Industrialization made Western economies hungry for raw materials, including timber and metals, coal, rubber, and chemicals, which could be wrested from less powerful societies by force and for overseas markets. Industrial era weaponry lent Western armies and navies military superiority, and because modern ships powered by coal and then petroleum required repair bases and refueling depots, Western sea power depended on control over islands and ports around the world. Also prompting imperialism was Europe's rapid population growth, which caused migration, not just to the Americas, but also to settler colonies far from the homeland. Geographical and scientific aptitude allowed for easier penetration of the African and Asian interior. In particular, medical advances, such as the anti-malarial treatment quinine, made it possible for Westerners to establish themselves in tropical zones where illnesses like sleeping sickness, yellow fever, and malaria had previously kept them from gaining footholds. Finally, a complex set of cultural factors motivated empire building. A sense of racial superiority, buttressed in many cases by the doctrine of social Darwinism discussed in Chapter 14, was widespread among white Europeans and Americans. Beyond that, many Westerners became convinced that they had a duty to teach and modernize the peoples of Africa and Asia. The English poet Rudyard Kipling famously labeled this the white man's burden, and the French spoke of their civilizing mission, or la mission civilisatrice. This attitude could be well-meaning, and Euro-American missionaries, doctors, and scientists, colonial officials sometimes did much useful work. However, they did so as much out of condescension as out of goodwill, and they often trampled on or eradicated native cultural practices and beliefs. This is the English form of social Darwinism as expounded by Rudyard Kipling. That's the white man's burden. Empires took different forms and were governed with different degrees of severity. Individual empires are dealt with on a region-by-region basis in the following section, but some generalizations are possible. Overseas empires and settler colonies were the best known. By far the largest was Britain's, on which the sun never set, as expressed in a famous motto of the time. France gradually accumulated the era's second largest empire in countries like Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, which had been more active during the Columbian age of exploration, continued to hold on to certain overseas possessions. After 1870, new countries such as Germany and Italy began to build overseas empires in an attempt to catch up with more established imperial powers. Land-based empires expanded as well. Austria, not commonly thought of as a colonizing power, maintained one in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, colliding with the empire ruled by the Ottoman Turks. Russia conquered Siberia, much of Central Asia, and for a time parts of North America. At the end of the century, Japan extended its imperial reach to the Asian mainland, a short distance away. Economic imperialism, which involved pressuring weaker nations to offer favorable trade terms rather than outright colonization, was practiced as well. Prominent targets during this century included Latin America and Qing China, and arguably Egypt during and after the construction of the Suez Canal. Let's see here. Let's read the note that says native elites. One technique commonly used by imperial powers was the Western-style training of native elites to serve as officials and bureaucrats, or of native troops, such as sepoys in India and askaris in Africa, to fill the ranks of overseas forces. The aims were to economize on labor and to ensure loyalty. The educational system in British India, in the words of one of its architects, was to create elites who were Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinion and morals and in intellect. Likewise, the reasoning behind America's sponsorship of the pro-U.S. Federalista Party in the newly acquired Philippines was that these picked Filipinos would be of infinite value as the chief agents in securing their people's obedience. In the economic sphere, compradors were native merchants, particularly in East and South Asia, who cooperated with Western colonists and corporations as commercial agents and middlemen. These were the native elite troops in India. Sepoys. As the century passed, imperial expansion caused a steady rise in global conflict. Campaigns of conquest were violent in their own right, and in the late 1800s, with few desirable territories left to be claimed, Euro-American competition over empire became increasingly bitter. Tensions were heightened further by specific geopolitical conflicts, including the Eastern question, how to fill the power vacuum caused in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean by the Ottoman Empire's steady decline, and the Great Game, the collision of British and Russian spheres of influence in Central Asia, and the scramble for Africa, the rush to subjugate the entire continent between the 1880s and 1910s. The growing intensity of nationalism in Western nations added to the problem. All this made it increasingly harder for Western states to maintain their balance of power. Between Napoleon's defeat in 1815 and the Crimean War, 1853 to 56, the settlement devised in the Congress of Vienna in 1815 preserved peace among the European powers. After mid-century, armed conflict became more common in Europe, including the Franco-Prussian War, which created the modern German state and the wars of Italian unification. While such wars were short and limited, they encouraged a growing spirit of belligerent patriotism, nicknamed jingoism by the British press. On the surface, relative stability prevailed among the Western powers between 1871 and 1914, a period in European history known as the Long Peace. Underneath, however, the potential for a major conflict grew, especially after 1890, when the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, a cautious diplomat and a key architect of the European balance of power, was dismissed by Germany's rash and impatient Emperor Wilhelm II. During the 1890s and early 1900s, the European alliance system divided the great powers into two armed camps. Germany and Austria were already aligned with Italy in the Triple Alliance, formed in 1881, although Italy would drop out in 1914. In the mid-1890s, France, bitter about defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, allied with Russia, which viewed Austria as a threat in the Balkans. Geographically, France and Russia now had their rivals surrounded as long as possible. Britain remained committed thanks to the Great Game in Central Asia. It viewed Russia as an enemy and had little affection for France. But after 1900, Britain grew increasingly alarmed by Germany's aggressive empire building, especially in Africa, and its rapid naval expansion, which threatened Britain's sea power, the root of Britain's global might. In 1907, Britain informally partnered with the Franco-Russian alliance, forming the Triple Entente. From this point forward, any crisis between two countries could potentially involve all of Europe's major powers, significantly increasing the likelihood of major war. Note, by the late 1800s, the Balkans had become Europe's most unstable region. Russia, Austria, Italy, and Ottoman Turkey all had ambitions there, and many Balkan states, including Serbia, were newly independent and fiercely nationalist. Several short conflicts broke out in the Balkans before World War I. All right. This is the question on how to fill the power vacuum caused in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean by the Ottoman Empire's steady decline. Eastern question. This is the rush to subjugate the entire African continent between the 1880s and 1910s. Scramble for Africa, very good. This is the collision of British and Russian spheres of influence in Central Asia and the Middle East. This is called the Great Game. Very good. Following the French Revolution and during the Industrial Revolution, European governments had to respond to the shockwaves caused by both events. The political philosophies and ideologies discussed in Chapter 14 were a prudent product of those responses. Between 1815 and 1848, most governments, convinced that even the slightest liberalism would lead to renewed chaos, attempted to minimize change or even undo what had transpired during the years of revolution. This arch-conservative stance, known as reaction, was the guiding principle of the Congress of Vienna, which not only ended the Napoleonic Wars, but also forged an informal agreement among Europe's major regimes to preserve order and prevent change. Monarchies were no longer absolute, but royal families were restored when possible, including France. Civil liberties were restricted, censorship was heavy, and secret police forces were common. Trade unions were illegal, as were political parties in many countries. Repression lightened somewhat in parliamentary states like Britain, where the 1832 Reform Act slightly expanded the vote and where the worst industrial era working conditions began to attract Parliament's attention, and France, where the 1830 revolution further limited the monarch's power. In Central and Eastern Europe, the level of repression was greater. If voting systems existed at all, they were limited, and Russia not only remained an absolute monarchy, but also continued the practice of serfdom. A key turning point came with the revolutions of 1848, whose underlying causes, including popular impatience with reactionary rule, socioeconomic stress caused by industrialization, and a series of bad harvests, such as the Irish potato famine, that caused the decade to be known as the Hungry Forties. The revolution began in France, where the king was deposed and Napoleon's nephew appointed president. Uprisings then spread to most of Europe, although they spared England and Russia. These were crushed by the summer of 1849, but had lasting effects nonetheless. They compelled Austria and German states like Prussia to grant constitutions, and since many of them had involved ethnic revolts against Austrian rule, they demonstrated the growing political importance of nationalism. They inspired Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to write the Communist Manifesto. Most of all, they hammered home the lesson of the French Revolution. The demands of ordinary people had to be taken seriously. Therefore, during the second half of the century, most European governments expanded political representation and legislated the improvement of working conditions, although whether they did so by means of reform or revolution varied. In Victorian Britain, Parliament gradually extended the vote to middle and lower class males by means of the Second and Third Reform Acts, and also granted economic concessions and fair labor laws to the lower classes. Britain, by the late 1800s, possessed the world's largest empire and was extremely prosperous. It wrestled, however, with the questions of women's suffrage and Irish nationalism. Let's read the note. Except in Ireland, Britain avoided outright revolution in the 1800s. Still, groups like the Chartist movement in the 1830s and 40s agitated for fairer work laws and expanded vote. They did not gain all their demands, but such popular pressure convinced the government to make some changes. France's progress toward democracy was less gentle. In 1848, all adult males could vote in France, but in 1851, the president, Louis Napoleon, staged a coup and found himself Napoleon III. Not an absolute dictator, he helped to modernize Paris and industrialize the country, but his humiliating defeat during the Franco-Prussian War caused his abdication. After a short but bloody revolution, a new democratic republic arose in 1871 and lasted until 1940. Democracy did not solve all of France's problems. Women remained without the vote, corruption and financial scandals rocked France, and worst of all was the Dreyfus Affair, in which the army and government falsely blamed a Jewish officer for the leaking of military secrets to Germany. This controversy divided the left, which maintained Dreyfus's innocence, from the right, which was convinced of his guilt, and exposed the ugly streak of anti-Semitism in modern European society. Note, economic concessions desired by the working class in any given country generally included all or most of the following: higher wages, shorter work days and work weeks, safer working conditions, insurance in case of injury, and pensions for retirement. The right to form trade unions and go on strike was considered crucial as well. Nationalism profoundly affected politics in Italy, Germany, and Austria. The unification of Italy as a parliamentary monarchy took place in the 1860s, although less than 5% of the population received the vote. The unification of Germany was spearheaded by Prussia in a series of 3 short conflicts culminating in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. The new German emperor shared power with a legislature called the Reichstag, and all adult males technically had the vote, although the electoral system was heavily stacked in favor of the upper classes. With Otto von Bismarck serving the emperor as chancellor and also as Europe's leading diplomat, Germany rapidly modernized thanks to a policy of state-directed industrialization. Despite his staunch conservatism, Bismarck craftily offered the lower classes substantial economic concessions, the most generous in Europe at the time, to keep them from becoming attracted to trade unions or socialism. In Austria, post-1848 liberalization led to the creation of a parliament in 1861 and various concessions to the empire's many minority populations whose nationalist aspirations were rising. The Volksglied, or Compromise, of 1867 granted equal status to Austria's largest minority, the Hungarians, and the state was renamed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In total, the empire had 11 official languages, although German and Hungarian remained most important. As in other parts of Europe, anti-Semitism became a major part of political life here. Even autocratic Russia was forced to change. Shaken by his country's embarrassing loss in the Crimean War, the moderately liberal Alexander II modernized Russia with a series of great reforms, chief of which was his 1861 emancipation of the serfs. However, Alexander was assassinated by radical terrorists who believed he had not gone far enough, and the conservative czars who succeeded him undid many of his changes. Nicholas II, who met with a terrible defeat during the Russo-Japanese War, almost lost his throne during the 1905 revolution. This compelled him to share power with a new and popularly elected legislature, the Duma. But once the danger passed, Nicholas weakened the Duma and avoided cooperating with it. Anti-Semitic persecution escalated in late Tsarist Russia, and pogroms, or anti-Jewish raids, became distressingly common. Okie dokie, let's see here. The revolutions of 1848 inspired this writer to write the Communist Manifesto, along with Friedrich Engels. Karl Marx, very good. Let's see. The chief example of anti-Semitism in France at this time, Dreyfus Affair, very good. In Germany, the chief diplomat, chancellor, the big dog, Otto von Bismarck. He leads the unification of Germany. And this happens in Russia in 1861. At the same time, notably, the American Civil War begins over slavery, the emancipation of serfdom in Russia. Very good. Okay, moving on. This was a time of decline for the Middle East as the glory days of the once mighty gunpowder empires faded. Safavid Persia had disappeared in the early 1700s, and although the Ottoman Empire survived into the early 1900s, it lost territory at an alarming rate during the 1800s and came to be derided as the sick man of Europe. Not only did the Ottoman Empire lose a number of wars to Austria and Russia during the 1700s, but also internal troubles plagued it. The chief dilemma was that sultans and reformers who wished to modernize met with resistance from Islamic traditionalist or influential elites who had a vested interest in preserving old ways. A key example involved the armed forces, where the once innovative janissaries, now privileged but woefully outdated, blocked any attempt to improve the military to the point of assassinating the sultan in 1807. Reformers had better luck between the 1820s and the 1870s, although not enough in the long run. Janissary power was broken in the 1820s, and the Army and Navy were upgraded and westernized. From 1839 to 76, in a series of changes known as the Tanzimat Reforms, the government promoted religious tolerance and equality before the law for non-Muslims, introduced Western science and technology into the educational system, boosted industry and built railroads and telegraphs, and liberalized and secularized the law code and legal systems. Sultan Abdul Hamid II even proclaimed the Constitution of 1876 and agreed to share power with an elected legislature. Unfortunately, in 1878, the Sultan suspended the Constitution for 20 years, and the Tanzimat effort fizzled. Internally, Abdul Hamid was caught between traditionalists who opposed any changes at all and a growing number of modernizing politicians and officers, the so-called Young Turks, who granted more change than he was willing to deliver. By the early 1900s, the Young Turks would play a decisive role in ending his rule. In addition, Ottoman domestic policy was further handicapped by revolts and wars that threatened the empire with disintegration. The Greek War of Independence inspired future nationalist uprising among other Balkan Christians, and by persuading Britain and Russia to intervene out of sympathy for the Greeks, it stoked a decades-long anti-Turkish prejudice in Europe. At the same time, the rebellion of Muhammad Ali, who transformed Egypt into an autonomous principality in 1805, along with the French colonization of Algeria, taken from the Turks in 1830 and brutally pacified by the end of the 1840s, demonstrated the Ottoman state's structural vulnerability. Before Ali's death in 1839, he created a Western style of military and industrialized the production of Egyptian cotton. Visionary in certain ways, he governed autocratically as Khedive, hereditary prince, and subjected cotton growers and textile workers to oppressive labor conditions. The Ottomans' external problems worsened after mid-century. Russia's annexation of Ottoman provinces on the Danube provoked the Crimean War, in which Britain and France stepped in to aid the Turks against Russia. Balkan nationalism intensified as illustrated by the Balkan crisis of 1876 to 78, when Bulgarian Serbs and others revolted against economically harsh policies. In lashing back, Ottoman troops committed anti-Christian atrocities, undermining the Tanzimat reform's modernizing spirit and triggering widespread anti-Turkish revulsion in Europe. Russia warred against the Ottomans on the rebels' behalf and imposed a punitive treaty. Although other European powers, not wishing the Ottomans to be fatally destabilized, negotiated a more lenient treaty, the rebel nations went free. Ottoman control over North Africa likewise weakened. Egypt remained outside the Ottoman orbit, ruled by the Khedives, Muhammad Ali's descendants, and then, after the 1850s, falling increasingly under European influence. The construction of the Suez Canal, financed by the French-dominated Suez Canal Company and overseen by the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, gave France economic leverage over the Khedive. That leverage passed in the 1870s and 1880s to Britain, which purchased shares in the canal and then stepped in militarily to save the Khedive from an 1881 revolt. In 1882, the British established a protectorate, the Anglo-Egyptian administration, which left the Khedive on the throne but placed real control in British hands. To the west of Egypt, the Ottomans had already lost Algeria to the French. They now watched helplessly as Tunisia fell to France, Morocco to the French and Spanish, and Libya to Italy. As the new country began, the Sultan's days were numbered, thanks to the pro-Western Young Turks who had coalesced during the late 1800s around an agenda of rapid modernization. Led by the officer Enver Pasha, the Young Turks deposed Abdulhamid II in 1908 and 09, installed a figurehead sultan, and restored the Constitution of 1876. The Young Turks pursued a program of industrialization, secularization, and socio-economic reform. However, they continued to lose territory in North Africa and the Balkans, and their decision to forge close ties with Germany led them to support the losing side of World War I, the final step in the empire's ultimate demise. Note, one of the Ottoman reformers' most tragic failures was their inability to develop a form of patriotism that included all subjects, regardless of ethnicity or religion. The ideology of Ottomanism, meant to forge this common sense of citizenship, did not inspire Muslims and was viewed by non-Muslims with suspicion. In the late 1800s, a more aggressive form of Turkish nationalism took wider hold, even among some reformers, and the persecution of minorities, especially Armenian Christians, became more common. As for Islamic Central Asia, home to the Silk Road Khanates, Russia waged long wars of imperial conquest here in the 1800s. The Russians fought to gain natural resources. Central Asia is a great cotton-producing center. Secure their open southern frontier, a long-standing strategic concern, and further their dream, never realized, of winning warm water ports on the Indian Ocean coast. As noted above, Russia's ambition in the region brought it into diplomatic conflict with the British, who feared any possible interference in their lines of communication to India. The resulting Great Game caused bitter Anglo-Russian rivalry until the early 1900s. Okie dokie. This was government-promoted religious tolerance and equality, importation of Western science and technology, the boosting of industry and railroads, and the liberalization and secularization of the law code and legal systems in the Ottoman Empire from 1839 to 76. It culminated in the Constitution of 1876, the Tanzimat reforms. Very good. This was the Ottoman attempt at a forged common citizenship, nationalism. Ottomanism, very good. Okay, let's go to Africa. Paradoxically, Africa, which had been victimized by foreign colonists and slave traders for hundreds of years, remained comparatively free of direct outside influence until well into the 1800s. The Ottoman Empire controlled North Africa. Omani Arabs ruled most of East Africa's shore and the Swahili ports after displacing the Portuguese, and the European presence on the continent was restricted to selected spots on the coast. In other words, many African societies were strong enough into the late 1700s and early 1800s to resist foreign domination. Others were cooperative enough that foreigners found it useful to work with them rather than fight them. Several, such as Benin, Dahomey, Congo, and the Ashanti Kingdom, played significant roles in the Atlantic slave trade. In exchange for gold and guns, they took prisoners from enemy peoples and sold them to Euro-American slavers. Among this era's most powerful African states were the following. First, let's read the note. The Atlantic slave trade continued to ravage Africa. Approximately 2 million Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas during the 1800s, but it was made illegal and eventually shut down. The East African slave trade ended as well during the late 1800s. The Barbary states of Islamic North Africa, present-day Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, technically ruled by the Ottomans, but increasingly autonomous. Piratical corsairs from these states threatened European and American shipping and enslaved captives. Their raids embroiled the young United States into the Barbary Wars, commemorated in line from the U.S. Marine hymn to the shores of Tripoli, and partly provoked the French colonization of Algeria starting in 1830. The Ashanti Kingdom in West Africa's Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, which dramatically built up its military during the late 1700s, financed by participation in the Atlantic slave trade. The Ashanti threatened European outposts and commerce along the Gold Coast and resisted Euro-American attempts to destroy the slave trade. Starting in 1823, Britain found itself locked in a long series of wars with the Ashanti, who kept their independence until 1902. The nearby Sokoto Caliphate, an Islamic union of Hausa-speaking states created by Usman de Fodio Perjani Jihad of 1804 and 1808, likewise relied heavily on slave labor and resisted the British until 1903. The Zulu Kingdom on the edge of Dutch and British possessions in South Africa. Before 1800, the Bantu-speaking Zulu were organized into small, relatively peaceful clans, but from 1816 to 28, a new chieftain, Shaka, united them into a single warlike tribe. Their rapid expansion caused a large wave of tribal migration throughout southern Africa, and they also clashed with Dutch Boers and British settlers. Only after several conflicts, especially the Zulu War of 1879, were they pacified. Zanzibar, which produced spices, sugar, and cloves for the Indian Ocean trade network and served as a key hub for the East African slave trade, ruled by the Arab Sultanate of Oman. 1698. It became the Omani capital in 1840 and was promoted to the status of sultanate in 1861. It controlled the Zanj, a large portion of the East African coast. Ethiopia, which remained Coptic Christian in predominantly Muslim East Africa. Ethiopia existed largely in isolation between the mid-1600s when it expelled the Portuguese in the mid-1800s, when Theodore II, a pro-Western but mentally erratic king, began a process of military modernization. This policy, continued by his successors, allowed Ethiopia to ward off European invasion. Its 1896 victory over Italian forces at Adwa ranks as one of the most embarrassing setbacks suffered by 19th century European powers. As the century progressed, nearly every part of Africa lost its freedom to European states. Coastal areas were the first to fall. South Africa, colonized by Dutch Boers, also known as Afrikaners in the mid-1600s, saw an influx of new settlers from the Napoleonic Wars, when the British assumed control over the region. Displaced by the British and angered by the newcomers' abolition of slavery, the Boers made a great trek to the north during the 1830s and founded their own states on the border of British South Africa. The Boers and British periodically clashed with each other, and more regularly with the local Hausa and Zulu until the capitulation of the latter in the Zulu War of 1879. The discovery of South African gold mines and diamond fields heightened military tensions there and led to the cruel exploitation of African laborers. Far to the north, the French colonization of Algeria was carried out during the 1830s and 40s, with scorched earth devastation and frightful violence against local civilians. Leading the resistance was the Sufi scholar Abd al-Qadir, internationally respected even after his defeat for the dignity and bravery with which his forces fought. The French became particularly attached to Algeria, viewing it as their most important possession in the way Britain regarded India. The economic and political domination of Egypt in the 1850s onward, thanks to the construction of the Suez Canal, is described above. Note, in 1856 and 57, British settlement in South Africa touched off the Hausa cattle-killing movement, an example of the many millenarian rebellions, or religiously inspired episodes of resistance, that occurred during this era of new imperialism. Here, the Hausa came to believe that if they killed their own livestock, who were already falling ill, the spirits would expel the British from their lands. Despite all such influence, only about 10% of the African territory fell under European control before 1880. At that point, the so-called scramble for Africa began, lasting until the eve of World War I and rapidly subjugating the entire continent. Thanks to geographical knowledge gained by explorers between the late 1700s and mid-1800s, and also to industrial-era weaponry and effective medical treatments for tropical diseases, Westerners were now able to press fully into the African interior. Civil and intertribal conflict made numerous parts of Africa vulnerable to European takeover. And African states that had benefited from the slave trade found themselves economically weakened when that commerce came to an end. A sad paradox about the end of slavery was that even where African economies remained free, they now turned to forms of plantation farming and resource extraction that were barely less brutal as systems of labor. The Europeans themselves were motivated by the combination of greed, gold, diamonds, ivory, rubber, cola nuts, palm oil were just a few of the resources they coveted. Belief in their own racial superiority, reinforced by the doctrine of social Darwinism and their condescending white man's burden conviction that they had a duty to civilize, what they thought of as the dark continent. Moreover, the centuries-long anti-slavery campaigns accustomed Westerners not to just taking military action in Africa, but also thinking of intervention there as morally justified. A pivotal moment in the scramble for Africa was the Berlin Conference, convened by the German statesman Otto von Bismarck to diffuse diplomatic tensions stirred up by Europe's headlong rush to carve up Africa. Boundaries were agreed upon, as were guidelines for further expansion, but long-term harm was done to Africa by the fact that the lines drawn on the map during and after Berlin reflected only European desires. They bore no relation to the traditional territorial demarcation used by Africans themselves, and even today, many African ethnic groups remain divided by European-drawn borders or forced by those borderlines into close proximity with their enemies. Europe's colonial policies varied widely in Africa. Britain controlled several colonies in the west, including the Gold Coast and Nigeria, after the defeat of the Ashanti Kingdom in the Sokoto Caliphate. But even more extensive was its nearly unbroken chain of possessions in the east, gained at the expense of the Omani Arabs. This ran from South Africa to Egypt, or from Cape to Cairo, as the imperialist Cecil Rhodes put it. As in India, the British governed with a blend of exploitative selfishness, racist sentiment, and well-meaning condescension. They trained native elites and troops in the Western style and brought with them new science, medicine, and industrial technology. Much of the same can be said of France, which, after its initial brutality in Algeria, acted mainly in accordance with its Mission Sylvestre. In addition to the island of Madagascar off the southeast coast, France dominated much of the Sahara North and vast portions of the West. French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa were among the largest colonies on the continent. French victory over the Wassoulou Empire, founded by Samori Touré, and the region of modern Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire, the so-called Mandingo War, was crucial in establishing French power there. Years later, Touré's grandson would become the first president of independent Guyana. By contrast, Portuguese rule in its colonies in Angola and Mozambique was quite harsh. Even worse were the Belgians and Germans. In the 1870s, Leopold II, the Belgian king, established a private company, later bequeathed to the Belgian nation, for the economic development of the Congo, and its claim to the colony was recognized at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85. Belgian-owned rubber plantations brutally forced Congolese laborers to meet production quotas, often allowing overseers to chop off the right hands of harvesters who fell short, and sometimes massacring them as punishment. Before the Belgians' arrival, Congo had a population of around 20 million, but that number fell to 8.5 million by 1911. Germany moved aggressively into Tanganyika, near Zanzibar in the east, and several small areas in the west. However, these were unprofitable leftovers, and the Germans also faced several costly uprisings. They killed over 250,000 to suppress the Maji-Maji revolt in German East Africa, where the rebels believed that drinking blessed water would keep them safe from European bullets. Compare this with similar beliefs among the Boxer rebels of China. Germany's infamous Herero Wars involved the use of concentration camps against civilians and killed nearly 80% of Southwest Africa's Herero natives. Some scholars consider this conflict an early instance of 20th century genocide. Within 3 decades, all of Africa, except for Liberia and Ethiopia, had been brought under Europe's sway. However, the scramble for Africa backfired on the Europeans by rousing their combative passions and contributing to the diplomatic tensions that caused World War I. In 1896, France and Britain almost came to blows because of the Fashoda incident, in which French troops moving eastward into the Nile Valley encountered British forces who regarded the region as theirs. German interference without French and Spanish plans for northwestern Africa led to the Morocco crisis in 1906 and another in 1911. Also destabilizing was Germany's public support of Dutch Afrikaners in the Boer War against Britain. Although the British had a more powerful army, the Boers were skilled sharpshooters fighting on their home territory. The war grew painfully vicious, with the British using concentration camps to keep 120,000 civilians, over 20,000 of whom died, from supporting Boer guerrillas. Germany's open sympathy for the Boers worsened Anglo-German relations, already strained by the two countries' naval race, with profound implications for the European alliance system that took shape prior to World War I. Let's read that note. In 1882, a millenarian revolt erupted in the Sudan, led by a figure claiming to be the Islamic Messiah called the Mahdi. In 1885, the Mahdi's army, driven by religious fervor and anti-colonial fury, crushed a British force at Khartoum. The Mahdi died soon after, but the rebellion was not put down by the British until 1898. All right, short review of Africa. Okay. This was an Islamic Union of Hausa-speaking states in Western Africa. They resisted the British until 1903. The Sokoto Caliphate. He united the Bantu-speaking Zulu tribes of South Africa. Shaka. A French-built and British-controlled canal in Egypt. Suez Canal. This was the conference in Germany hosted by Otto von Bismarck to separate Africa in the struggle for Africa. Berlin Conference. Belgian king, who was in charge of the colony in this is personal possession in Africa, in the Congo. Leopold II. And this is the name for religiously motivated revolt. Millenarian rebellion. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end it there. So here's the thing. Make sure you do the packet, even if we come back to school tomorrow and have read this. I'm going to give you a quiz over this stuff. So make sure you are familiar with the key points and terms. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. See if I can stop the recording.